Good morning, Dan and Amy. Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, meddling, missile testing, warmongering, stealing. We've got a lot to cover. And so we best get to it. We're pleased to be joined by Jed Babbin, former United States Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, contributor to the Washington Times and the American Spectator. Jed, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, good to be with you guys.
Why don't we start with Joe Biden? That's always a good place to start, his opining on geopolitical matters. Regarding China, the real problem the Chinese communists have is they can't figure out how they're going to deal with the corruption that exists within the system. Corruption and communism, shocking. I mean, you know, they're not bad folks, but guess what? They're not competition for us. So they're not competition, and they're not bad folks, those Chinese communists, according to Biden.
Yeah. Well, I could go on for hours on old Joe. I mean, he's apparently a very nice guy. I've never met him, but he's one of those
very touching
guys who you just want to play poker with or, take out fishing or something like that. But God knows you don't want to vote for the son of a gun. I mean, he's so wrong in so many ways. The fact is that the Chinese are eating our lunch. They've gone from, when you look at the economic factors, you look at the cyber espionage, the cyber security issues that we suffer from that, all of these things, and quite frankly, their huge military buildup and their aggression around the world. I mean, there's really no question that they are competing with us in ways that are strategic and are aimed at reducing our influence in the world and reducing our status as a superpower. And if you look at just the most recent articles that I've seen, and I wrote something about this in the American Spectator today, I mean, he's talking about how the union people are always supporting him, and, quite frankly, they have. But if you look at the past 18 years, 8 of which he was vice president for and participating with the Obama administration, well, America lost 3.5 million manufacturing jobs in between 2001 and 2015. And those are due to unfair trade practices and currency manipulation by China. They've effectively stolen a large part of our economy through the theft of intellectual property and unfair trade practices. So, Joe is wrong on the economic sense. I can go on and on about the military buildup they're making, the fact that they're challenging us, they're developing hypersonic missiles, they're spending a lot more on their defense budget than pretty much any country other than us in terms of proportional terms and buying power of their currency. These guys are an adversary, they're a competitor, and Joe, again, he's a nice guy, but he's completely out to lunch.
Yeah, but do you think he'll try and take away Trump Democrats? I mean, is that the play here?
Amy, I think he's going to try, but I don't know that he can succeed. I mean, if you look at the way that the unions supported Trump in 2016, and again, the fact that Joe and Obama's policies had led to an enormous reduction in American jobs, now they're coming back thanks to Trump. I don't know that he's going to make that a success. I don't think he can.
All right, we've got a lot of axis of evil countries to cover here, so let's move on to North Korea. Interesting piece by a Tufts University professor, Sung-Yoon Lee, in the New York Times over the weekend about Kim Jong-un's short-range projectile launch on Saturday. He writes that it created the illusion that a more severe crisis had been averted while threatening to bring on one of those next by not launching an ICBM. Unless that is the United States backs down. This is what he says, sort of standard playbook orthodoxy from the North Koreans in terms of trying to get sanctions relaxed by the United States. And he suggests that the real play the United States should be making right now is to tighten up sanctions on the North Koreans, including and pass new ones, including the Otto Warmbier banking restrictions that involve North Korea. What's your view on what the U.S. reaction should be to what Jong-un did this weekend?
Well, as much as I hate to agree with anybody in academia,
yes.
I think the professor is right. I think that's exactly what we need to do. We need to keep on with the sanctions, tighten them up as much as we can, go on with whatever other program we have in terms of sanctions against North Korea. And God knows we do not want to back off on any of that stuff. I think Kim Jong-un is testing. He always will. He's going to go back to his more belligerent rhetoric pretty quickly and maybe even shoot off some longer-range missiles. I mean, Lord only knows. They may even test another nuke. But that's their typical blackmail. They're not going to get away with it with this president. And, I think that the right course is what we've set. I think Mr. Trump is quite frankly too optimistic about what's going to happen with North Korea. They're not going to denuclearize. They're not going to give up their nukes peacefully. It's just not going to happen. So we'll just have to see how far they're willing to push it, and quite frankly, what else we can do.
All right, let's move over to Iran. The U.S. is sending USS Abraham Lincoln carrier strike group and a bomber task force into the Middle East. What's the real reason why we're positioning ourselves there?
Well, Amy, I think it's fairly obvious that Iran is taking a lot of aggressive actions. I mean, you look at the Gaza Strip and the Hamas attacks on Israel. That's, I'm sure, backed up by Iran and probably propelled by Iran. You see them backing the Houthi rebels in Yemen, and they're still fighting with the Saudi coalition there. I mean, there's a lot of places around the country, well, not our country, fortunately, but around the Middle East and around the world where Iran's malicious influence is being felt, and sending them a signal like this is okay. Certainly, I don't think we want to just go to war with them on the spur of the moment. But again, with respect to them, I would say the same thing as I would say to North Korea. They are not going to give up their nuclear program peacefully. So at some point, we're going to have to deal with it. And I don't know what that point is, but it's not reached quite yet.
There's a truce now with the respect to the fighting in Gaza, but Hamas and Islamic Jihad terrorists said on Sunday that they're close to open war with Israel. Is that just saber rattling, or is this something of particular concern?
Well, I think it's a great concern. I think it's not just saber rattling. I think, quite frankly, they were due for war. I think at this point, you're going to see probably a larger war in that area. I was predicting several months ago that we would see an Hezbollah war between Israel and the Hezbollah forces, the terrorists in Lebanon. I think you might see the Lebanese terrorists, Hezbollah, get involved at this point. It's certainly not over. The Israelis are planning a bigger move against Gaza, which they should be making, and Hamas is not going to stop firing the rockets.
Now, Ilhan Omar has weighed in on this. I know you're going to be interested to hear what she has to say. She responding to the fighting in Gaza. How many more protesters must be shot? Rockets must be fired. Little kids must be killed until the endless cycle of violence ends. The status quo of occupation and humanitarian crisis in Gaza is unsustainable. Only real justice can bring about security and lasting peace.
Yada, yada, yada. That's the same garbage that we've been hearing from the Palestinian leadership for, 50 years. She's just spouting their talking points, and it's painful to listen to anybody like that. I just don't bother. The real issue here is the Israelis are taking every step, they have for many, many years, taking every step to prevent civilian casualties. But you have a situation where Hamas hides in churches and mosques, in residential buildings, and they launch their weapons from there. The Israelis have no choice. People are going to get killed because Hamas is effectively making them human shields by hiding among them. The Israelis have every right. In fact, they have a duty to protect themselves and their people by shooting at these guys wherever they hide.
Going over to Russia and Vlad and the boys there. Trump meets with Putin last week, says they had a good meet, talked about the Mueller report. They both agreed there was no collusion. I don't know what else they would do. And didn't get around to talking about election meddling from a previous or future, but otherwise a good meeting, and we're going to do some business with Russia, and everything's fine.
Yeah, it was a lengthy Friday phone call for 1 hour.
Yeah, it was not a meeting; it was a phone call. But
okay.
I don't get what Trump is doing. There's so many other things he's doing that are very good, but talking with Putin like this, apparently confiding in Putin, maybe getting counseled by Putin. I don't know what he's thinking. I don't know what Trump is thinking, because, obviously among the untrustworthy people in the world, there's probably a top 5, and I would guess that Putin is within the top 2. I mean, anybody who trusts him is, quite frankly, being suckered, and I just don't get what Mr. Trump is trying to do.
It's just like the bromance again it's flaring up. It's just so strange.
He likes anybody who's not
weird.
Jim Comey. Yes.
Yeah, well, there is that. But, on the other hand, there are other people who can be or should be distrusted, in addition to Mr. Comey. And again, Putin is right at the top of the list. I mean, you can look at the history of Mr. Putin's life. You can look at his background in the Soviet KGB. You can look at a whole lot of other things, and you can come to a conclusion about his trustworthiness. And quite frankly, there is no reason to trust him on any subject. So I don't know what Mr. Trump is doing. The fact that they're talking is not a bad thing. As Churchill said, jaw is better than war. Mm-hmm. But, you got to really, I'd have much more faith in these conversations if John Bolton was on the extension phone.
Let's come back to our hemisphere, Venezuela. Some suggestion that Trump invoke the Monroe Doctrine to facilitate the end of the Maduro regime and usher in the era of Guaido. What do you think the United States should be doing, if anything, that it's not?
Well, funny you mentioned the Monroe Doctrine. 1823, no European nation shall try to colonize the Western Hemisphere. That kind of is a really good idea, but we have not just the Russians in there and the Cubans in there. We have the Iranians in there. They're trying to create another Syria, a tributary state in Venezuela, and so far they're succeeding. Mr. Guaido misjudged the allegiance that he might get from military people and tried to stir up a coup last week. Didn't work. I think at this point, we do not have an immediate move. I think we need to track this very carefully, and quite frankly, we need to find a way to stir up a rebellion amongst the Venezuelans, if necessary, to arm them and provide them with communications equipment so that they can throw Maduro out. I think if we invade there, I think we would be not greeted as liberators. We would be greeted as conquerors. The bad guys from the north, the gringo turistas, are back. So I think at this point, again, I'm not ruling it out. I would not rule out military intervention there if things get a lot worse in terms of Russian and Iranian involvement. But at this point, I would not suggest that we should do that.
Spanning the globe with Jed Babbin, former United States Deputy Undersecretary of Defense, contributor to the Washington Times, the American Spectator. Jed, thanks for joining us. As always, appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. He joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line. And Dan, we have some breaking news. Duchess Meghan of Sussex is in labor.
Oh, good grief. I mean, are you serious?
I am.
No,
she went to Northwestern. She was a Kappa.
Yeah, yeah.
She's a princess.